Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I've actually been trying to come for a couple of years now, so this is quite the treat. So of course I want to thank Tim and the Mountain Royal Center for Community Disaster Research for hosting me today. I'm really thrilled to be here to talk about the issue of gender in disaster. Like Tim mentioned, gender is often overlooked in disaster research, and as I'll point out, also in emergency preparedness and mitigation policies and responses. So I probably don't have to, but my goal for today is to convince you all that gender matters and gender matters in disaster. So, let's see here. I'm like super proud of my title. Were the women washed away? Why aren't we talking about women in disaster? All right, so I'm going to make the case for gender-sensitive disaster research and response. I'm going to first start by saying that the study of gender has become a prominent subfield in social science research, and the section on sex and gender is actually the largest in the American Sociological Association. So if you're a member of the American Sociological Association, you can sign up for sections that are field specific. And so the area of gender just keeps growing and growing. Yet while gender has not been completely ignored in disaster research, you had Lori Peek here last year. She works with Alice Fothergill. They do some really incredible work on disaster and gender, as well as Elaine that you mentioned. Yet it remains on the periphery of this scholarship, and it's overlooked in much federal and local government emergency preparedness policies and grassroots responses and rebuilding effort. So today I will argue that by overlooking gender in disaster, our understanding of who is most vulnerable to risk and how we should respond both during and after disaster is not benignly incomplete, but severely inadequate. Okay, that is, if we want to mitigate the effects of disaster for people, especially already marginalized groups, right? So today I'm going to talk a lot about, poor African American communities in New Orleans. Then we need to use what's called an intersectional lens to study the response to disaster. So that is looking at disaster risk, the options that people have during disaster, their decision-making processes, their experiences through a intersectional lens that is looking at race, class, and gender, and how all three of these things come together to shape people's options and lived experiences of disaster. So scholars who study gender might still be considered radical intellectuals and researchers, and this is one reason I'm coming up with for why we still don't talk about gender in disaster research. Sometimes disaster scholars, especially if they're women, can be seen as pushing biased agendas. Well, of course, you would say it's important to research women because you're a woman, but isn't it the case that if we talk about women, then our research is biased in some way? So this is particularly the case for women scholars who are often seen as gendered persons first and skilled researchers second. And also because gender is often interpreted as meaning woman. And I do want to note that this is not completely incorrect, as gender or women's studies first emerged to right a severe bias in scholarly research, which is the study of men as a stand-in for all people, or as more important because of their privileged positions in public life. In other words, the marginalization of gender research in some circles is underpinned by some of these ideas. But it is absolutely the case that if we leave women out of analyses and response plans, we are not creating neutral disaster policies, but rather privileging the male experience in male bodies, which are often interpreted as the generic person. Okay, and I think this is, if nothing else, this is my take-home point today. So I'm going to repeat it, that if we leave women out of analyses, out of research, out of response plans, we're not creating neutral disaster policies, but rather privileging the male experience as one that is supposedly generic. Okay, so for example, my When I was living in New Orleans, my husband, who was in medical school, worked in triage centers in the Lord & Taylor's department store. So Charity Hospital, which served a lot of poor and indigent in New Orleans, was shut down. There's still a lot of controversy around this because people have said that it is actually okay to reopen it. But by closing down Charity Hospital, you're not serving a particular population. So as a medical student, the med school decided to open up these basically tents within Lord & Taylor's department store in order to provide medical assistance. But they didn't have obstetricians, they didn't have gynecologists, they didn't have pediatricians, right? They weren't prepared to provide, provide women the health needs that they would need, right? So there were a lot of consequences regarding, unwanted pregnancies, high-risk pregnancies, excuse me. And so what ends up happening is that if we don't talk about women, it's not, right, if we don't, talk about women's health, we're not creating a neutral, triage center. We're not creating gender-neutral responses to disaster. We're rather ignoring or pushing women and families to sort of the recesses of these spaces, and assuming that if we provide, that by providing this health care and not talking about gender, that we're servicing a generic person. Another example would be, and I'm going to talk about this more later in my talk, is that women experience high rates of domestic and sexual assault after Hurricane Katrina. More research really needs to be done on this, and one of my arguments today is that we don't have a lot of research that looks at gender. But the little that we do points to very important issues, community issues, that aren't being considered when we ignore gender and look solely at issues of race or ethnicity and class. And so there was no prioritizing services for women who might be experiencing sexual or domestic assault. Planned Parenthood, for example, was shut down. Women could, women's shelters were shut down. A lot of sort of grassroots, local level work that was meant to mitigate the experiences of women or help pull them out of otherwise violent or potentially violent environments were just not available. And so, one question I have when I sort of dig through, and try to find the research on women in disaster is, why not? Why aren't we responding to disaster, by making sure that in addition to or at our triage centers, we're providing assistance to women who need to report or need help in violent domestic situations. So privileging men as a generic person has been the case historically in medical and physical science research in the global north, as well as in social science research that shies away from asking questions about how gender differently shapes the lived experiences and thus the personal and social opportunities, status, and power of women and men. So what do we look at when we study disaster? And we look at issues of race and class. And of course, this is very important, right? So just because I'm here today talking about gender doesn't mean I'm suggesting that should replace work on race and class, but that should be considered in addition. So focusing on poverty and disaster, after all, makes sense. It's clear that those with few social and monetary resources would face the most risk during disaster. The poor have fewer options in terms of planning, evacuating, responding, and choosing where they settle in the first place. So in New Orleans, for example, this has been historically an issue of redlining and pushing some people into settling in floodplain zones. And of course, Hurricane Katrina is a very important disaster in that it really injected a discussion of race. A much needed discussion of race into our dialogue about inequalities in general and specifically risk. Right? Why is it that some people are at greater risk of disaster than others? So racism rose to the forefront of both scholarly and public discussions of disaster in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, which devastated cities from Morgan City, Louisiana to Biloxi, Mississippi, and Mobile, Alabama, right? So not just New Orleans. Of course, it's New Orleans that's garnered the most attention as racism shaped the geography of inequality in the city. So I'm going to show a couple of quotes. Tulane University geographer Richard Campanella describes New Orleans as a city with settlement shaped by an ethnic, what he calls an ethnic geography, with mostly white, wealthy residents living in higher elevated and environmentally secure areas. He notes, areas that lay farthest from sources of nuisance and risk and closest to amenities and opportunities commanded the highest prices and attracted the best infrastructure and housing. And after the Civil War, newly freed blacks who were destitute and the target of racial prejudice had few other options than to settle in risky and less desirable areas in the back of town. And we might identify one of these areas today as the lower Ninth Ward, which received a lot of attention post-Katrina and was essentially washed away. And then it got a lot of attention as Brad Pitt, you know, kind of cruised into town, raising money and talking about all these homes he was going to build, all these environmentally friendly homes. And I'm not sure what the number is today, but 10 years out, the number of homes that his project has produced,
it's like 80 or 85 right now.
Not very many, not very many. Okay, so immediately following the storm, it's important to note that 61% of New Orleans residences were flooded. While whites made up 28% of the city's population and 20% of the residents living in flooded areas, blacks made up 67% of the city's population and 76% of those homes that were below sea level. So obviously, carefully considering class, race, and how it differently situates people in relationship to risk, whether it's an environmental, you know, of course it's debatable, right, about Hurricane Katrina, right, part environment, part social. Disasters or technological disasters, obviously these topics are very important. But what this historical account and these statistics miss is that many of these residents were women. Right, so when we see images of the Superdome, we see, anguished black faces. It's very clear that race and class, historical prejudice, shaped risk for certain people in New Orleans. But what we don't often pay attention to is the fact that these images often show women with their little ones in tow, women with elderly kin that they were responsible for, right? So maybe parents who were dependents as well. So the story of Hurricane Katrina and the story of many disasters is one about family, okay? Family, and many times single or female-headed household families. So by leaving out gender, we don't just leave out women's experiences, we leave out a discussion of families and how family plays a role in decision-making around disasters and experiences and whether or not people are going to relocate. So I'll talk numbers in a little bit, but many single or female-headed households did not return to New Orleans. And this researcher, Jessica Party, who's at the Rochester Institute of Technology, talked to a lot of single mothers who mentioned they ended up in Houston or San Antonio, and they talked about the infrastructure of these cities next to New Orleans. Now, yes, you would assume, the infrastructure in Houston is obviously going to be much better than that of post-Katrina New Orleans, but what they said was that oftentimes it was better than pre-Katrina New Orleans. Okay, there were better schools, there were better jobs, there was more assistance, there were more affordable neighborhoods that had less crime. And so a lot of times these families didn't come back. And so in a paper I'm writing with a graduate student at SIU who's in the Public Policy Institute right now, we're really interested in how the policies, the response to disaster, the rebuilding plans after Hurricane Katrina has not considered not only for African Americans, but mothers and their families. And so, right, this is not, these women aren't just not coming back because they decide to stay elsewhere, but structurally, the city is not being rebuilt for them. Okay. So the idea is the poor aren't just poor, they're women and men, they're mothers and fathers, they're pregnant, they're caring for children, they have adult dependents, they're navigating gendered lives shaped by race and class, and all of these things come together to shape experiences of disaster, decisions about whether or not you're going to evacuate, right? Whether you're going to pull your children out of school, whether or not you can afford to take time off work, right? Because you're the primary care breadwinner. You know, a lot of single mothers rely on kinship networks in order to provide childcare so that they can go to work, right? So if their support network leaves and doesn't return, can they return to the city? Those sorts of things affect whether or not people are going to respond to calls for evacuation, right? So, you know, it's fine to have a police officer go down the street and call for a mandatory evacuation and tell people to evacuate. But if they don't have, you know, the resources, that's going to be a problem. But also, what are the other tensions? What are the tensions that are associated with being a gendered person, with being a mother, with being pregnant, right? That might shape your experiences as to whether or not you can or feel like it's in your best interest to evacuate. Okay, so speaking of Elaine, I wanted to share this quote. I find this sort of my go-to quote. She says that in over 50 years of research on emergencies, disasters, and catastrophes in the United States, a conspicuous silence around gender has been maintained, a looking away, perhaps a calculated blindness. Okay, and so she spends, her career is dedicated to understanding gender and disaster, and I'm going to go ahead and plug her book, The Women of Katrina, How Gender, Race, and Class Matter in an American Disaster. And of course, the idea is that a lot of these lessons that she sort of unpacks in her book can be applied to other disasters. Okay, so when we're talking about issues of race and class, we have to keep in mind that single mothers in particular were affected after Hurricane Katrina. They faced the constraints of poverty and racism, but also that of gender, whereby they were making the best decisions they could for their families, their children and other dependents. So they had to consider just how they might weather or evacuate the storm, but this means that their jobs and abilities to support their households had to be considered, pulling their children out of school. I already mentioned that, and prenatal and postnatal care as well, which I'm particularly passionate about. So you might ask, why is this? Why don't we talk about gender and disaster? And I discussed a little bit about the masculinist traditions in scientific research, and this really can't be overstated, right? It takes a particular incentive to look at women and not just see race and class. Again, believing we don't want to believe that gender-free means gender-neutral. But what I'm talking about today, or what I want to answer today, is what are the consequences of this blindness? So I'm going to talk about what we do know about gender and disaster, although it's not a whole lot, but what do we know, and how can it convince us that it's an important thing to take into consideration, and how these insights might help to make the argument that gender is key in disaster work. And when I say work, I mean research and response, right? So research on an academic level and a community level, and response on a community level. So today, I'm going to talk about Hurricane Katrina, obviously. I'm going to take Hurricane Katrina just as a case study, okay, which is important. So I want to encourage you to think about how these same lessons might apply to different sorts of disasters in different parts of the world, and how we might revise our modes of inquiry or more fully capture the experience of disaster, especially for vulnerable populations. So you're probably all reading that right now. Don't read it yet. So, as Tim mentioned, I lived in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina, and this shaped my interest in disaster. I was a graduate student at Tulane University, when I experienced Hurricane Katrina. And as a non-native, as somebody who's from Michigan, I didn't take the idea of a hurricane really freaked me out, right? I mean, I grew up with tornadoes and blizzards and stuff like that, but the idea of a hurricane really scared me, and I decided, there's a lot of talk about how people suffer sort of a hurricane fatigue, right? If you live through so many and there aren't, huge consequences, then why would you evacuate for this one, right? And so, it's very easy, and in the media following Hurricane Katrina, people were certainly blaming some people for not evacuating. Why wouldn't you evacuate? But to some people, it was just another hurricane. They had lived through many before. And I also, it's important to note that I also had the social networks and the financial means to evacuate. I was a graduate student, so I wasn't necessarily, I was leading a TA ship, but the whole faculty were evacuating, so I wasn't really leaving work. I didn't have children. I had a working car. I had a credit card, right, because I had credit. I had social networks. I had people who could put me up for free in Michigan, right? Not all my networks were locally based, so I had the privilege in order to do this. So I'm just going to read a couple of snippets from a chapter that was recently published where I talk a little bit about my own experiences and how this got me interested in gender and disaster. Sort of journal form, a little bit of insight into me. So I had been evacuated for 3 months when I returned to Hurricane Katrina, or to New Orleans. It was late December, and I was returning to the city to complete my master's degree. During my post-Hurricane Katrina exodus, I had stayed with family in Michigan, and for Christmas that year, my mom asked me whether I wanted a water filter or a handgun. She was nervous for me to return to a city that was a disaster zone. After all, she had seen the television coverage of the storm with dead bodies floating down the streets and women shown as pregnant in sweltering shelters, anguishing mothers searching for their children, and exhausted older women wading through filthy water. There was a sense that women were particularly at risk in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, but I assured my mom that a water filter would do, no need for the handgun, and that I would be fine navigating my life in this battered city. And I don't have this up here, but I wanted to read this as well. I became acutely aware of what it means to be a woman living in a disaster zone shortly after returning to New Orleans. My mom, who helped me to move back, decided to stay through New Year's Eve, and we made our way to the French Quarter to celebrate with locals who reveled in being home, many for the first time since the storm. We shuffled down the dark streets, weaving through crowds of people who were drinking and dancing, and with caution and angst, we walked past military police peppering the old cobblestone streets. They wore sand-washed camouflage, carried automatic weapons, and drove around in armored vehicles. These were daunting and serious men who stood in stark contrast to the resilient New Orleanians attempting to reclaim their city with boisterous celebration. And their presence also struck me as a sign that New Orleans had become not just a militarized space, but also a masculinized space. Okay, so what did it mean to return to a city that was occupied by a lot of military men, as well as a lot of men who migrated or immigrated into the city in order to rebuild it, right? So I don't know the numbers, but ever since Hurricane Katrina, the number of Latino residents has skyrocketed. At the same time, you have a lot of families who evacuated, right? And what this meant was a lot of women who evacuated. And so the ratio of women to men was really skewed after Hurricane Katrina, and did indeed create an uncomfortable space, to say the least, for women. With streetlights inoperable, police slow to respond, and men dominating public spaces, New Orleans became an exceptionally unfriendly place for women long after the storm. And this sort of post-disaster environment constrains the freedom of women who, according to Sarah, which is I'll have to look it up. It's a research center, experienced high rates of sexual harassment and assault. Media reports of sexual assault, of course, emerged first with stories about the horrendous environment of the Superdome, which I'm sure most people have heard of. Heard stories about where people reported witnessing the rape of women and girls. Now, of course, there are disputes about whether these things happened, to what degree they happened, were people murdered, in what way were they murdered, were there rapes, what was happening to children. But what we do know, what we do know is that women experienced an estimated 45% increase in sexual assault in the months following Hurricane Katrina. Right? As I mentioned, not a lot of policing agencies, when they were there, they were doing other things, not a lot of effort or thought put into responding to disaster in a way that would mitigate these sorts of experiences for women. So this threat emerged, and it's not insignificant, that it emerged in an environment where men occupied hyper-masculinized roles as protectors and first responders with power and control of spaces, bodies, and resources. Now, of course, sexual assault is often underreported because of shame, beliefs about what counts as rape, the fact that when you recount rape, you're reliving maybe assault, right, in some way. But also there was little to no effort by organizing agencies to create rape crisis centers or disseminate information where women could go for safety or to report assaults. Policing agencies were thin and women's safety was not a priority. So when I returned 3 months after the storm, a lot of there were like virtually no street lamps working, but also the street lights were out. So instead of maybe driving down the street and catching a street light every few blocks, at every intersection there would be a stop sign. And I remember feeling very uncomfortable late at night going through supposedly abandoned neighborhoods, having to stop. Right, making a decision like, should I just go through these stop signs? Am I going to get pulled over? Do I want to be pulled over by a police officer? And so making this decision to stop at every intersection and feeling like I was making myself vulnerable by doing so. In addition to the rise in sexual assault, women also experienced higher rates of domestic violence. Before Hurricane Katrina, 33.6% of women in the city reported intimate partner psychological victimization, and this number rose to 42.5% after the storm. Right, of course, there's always questions about these numbers. Is it much higher actually because of biases in the collection of data? And post-Katrina, intimate partner violence rates were reportedly 3 times higher than pre-Katrina. So the lack of access to basic financial, public, and social network resources after Katrina compounded already vulnerable women's risk to violence and forced many into life-threatening situations without the means to escape, right? So if you are already living in a situation where you didn't have a whole lot of options, you didn't have a lot of social networks and financial options, this was even more so after disaster, right? What are your options? Right, and a lot of these women rely on formal options, right? Community-based, federal and locally based government options. And of course, right, it's not just enough to provide these for women, but you have to get out word, right? Women have to know where to go, who to call. So the question is, how do you reach these women? With city infrastructure collapsed and people dispersed, previously important resource sources, including women's shelters and crisis hotlines, were closed immediately after Katrina. Although it is important to note that some local advocates, specifically one I want to note here, working for the New Orleans Battered Women's Shelter, did not evacuate, but instead stayed to help victimized women. So when support was there for women, it was very few organizations that stayed open. It meant that local community members who were dedicated to this work had to weather the storm or come back immediately after the storm, which means living in a disaster zone, right, where there's no power, military presence and that sort of thing. All right, living in a disaster zone, not fun. Were safe. And so women who did not report suffering sexual assault or domestic assault there's some indication in the research that they still felt uncomfortable, right? Moving around the space without street lamps, without, corner telephones if they needed to call for help, that sort of thing. I'm not sure if, policing agencies were available if they needed them. Historian Mary Gemin worried about being a potentially vulnerable woman after weathering the storm. She says that the prospect of being the only person on the block and a lone woman at that bothered me a bit. I want to leave off that part. Bothered me a bit. Given reports of looting, pot shots at police, and a general sense of lawlessness. And she later suggests that it's important to consider whether or not all women feel equally threatened. So she says that the protection by police was indeed racialized, that white women at times occupied a status as protected in a way that black women and black men did not, where they continued to experience continued suspicion and hostility. So the threat of harm by men who dominated the city might have accounted partly for the low repopulation rates of women. New Orleans saw a 45.2% drop in the female population in 2007, so even a year after the storm. I also want to talk about reproductive health. I already mentioned the closing of Charity Hospital and the pop-up triage centers. The Federal Emergency Management Agency worked with the Department of Health and Human Services to assure safety of food, safety of water, and the environment, to treat the severely ill and injured, and to identify the dead. Yet I would argue that they all but ignore the specific medical needs of women struggling through pregnancies and postpartum recovery in the disaster zone and in nearby cities, and who are often without insurance and vital information about where they could receive affordable and sometimes emergent medical treatment. So according to the Center for Disease Control 2013, disasters increase the risk of low birth weight, preterm birth, early pregnancy loss, spontaneous abortion, decreases in infant head circumference, and pregnant women are more susceptible to infection during disaster. And you can think of Hurricane Katrina and the dirty water and the lack of clean running water and electricity. They need particular immunizations and disaster-related stress like living without running water, being stranded in the hot and humid Superdome, evacuating the city on overcrowded buses, or being stranded on highway overpasses could have more serious repercussions for the health of pregnant women and fetuses, but we need more research on this. After Hurricane Katrina, many women found themselves in new locations without prenatal care or other medical records. So rates of teen pregnancy skyrocketed, sexually transmitted diseases, including HIV and AIDS, were also particularly high in New Orleans and Louisiana before the storm, and continued to be an issue afterwards, as many women's health care centers, including the all-important Planned Parenthood, were destroyed and or abandoned after the flood. I don't know how many people are keeping up with the Planned Parenthood debate in the States right now. With lack of access to doctors and pharmacies for birth control prescriptions, New Orleans actually experienced a baby boom. I don't know if anybody's heard of this. Baby boom after Hurricane Katrina. That scholars Willinger and Gerson refer to as Katrina babies. There's a 4.3% increase in births between women between 20 and 34 years old in 2006. So it was clear that women lacked access to basic reproductive medical attention and access to birth control. A lot of these were unplanned and unwanted pregnancies, and that there's an ongoing need for obstetrics and pediatric care in the city today. So in my attempts to try to find research, community level or university level research, in this case, right, so we go to the center. I wanted to know, come on, surely we responded to women's reproductive health care needs after Hurricane Katrina, and the only thing I found so far was this, images of military women after Katrina who were being shipped out of the city to give birth, so close to their due dates, and their families were flown to San Antonio, Texas to deliver their children. And of course, I was talking with Tim about this earlier, and it's hard to believe that these were all service women. I'm assuming that some of these were spouses of servicemen and women. So this is the only example I found of the military caring for pregnant women in some way, so getting them out of the city in order to give birth. Research on gender and disaster also covers the gender of gentrification. So there's a lot of discussion about what it means to rebuild New Orleans, who's coming back to New Orleans. Ray Nagin famously called for New Orleans to once again be a chocolate city shortly after the storm, and that was very controversial. Shop owners in the French Quarter were capitalizing on it by making t-shirts where he was in like a Willy Wonka hat. So when we talk about gentrification, we're often talking about issues of race and gender. And tonight I've been talking a lot about this during my visit here, about who is moving into New Orleans, right? So are we rebuilding in New Orleans? Do we care? First of all, do we care about the people who lived in New Orleans? And how can we measure whether or not we care about them? Well, we can look at policies and rebuilding plans, right? Are these populations that live there, and sometimes for generations deep, right, where they no longer even had deeds to their homes because the homes had been passed down over generations, and this created a lot of problems when people were trying to access FEMA money in order to rebuild their homes. How could they, prove that they actually own their homes? So in a Times-Picayune article on July 13th of this year, journalist Richard A. Webster notes that New Orleans population approaches pre-Katrina numbers. He says, after Hurricane Katrina forced the exodus of tens of thousands of New Orleanians 10 years ago now, there were fears the city would never recapture its lost population, but a report released by the data center on Monday, July 13th, should put those worries to rest. Overall, 40% of the city's 72 neighborhoods have recovered. 90% of the population they had before the storm, with 16 neighborhoods exceeding their pre-Katrina numbers. Since June 2010, the numbers of households receiving mail increased by 19,651%, or 19,000, that would be ridiculous. Right, 19,651, with 65 out of 72 neighborhoods experiencing some level of gain. This is good news. I'm not going to say it's not good news. But two questions we should be asking is, where would New Orleans have been if there had been no storm? Okay, so great, we're approaching pre-Katrina numbers, but where would these numbers, or where should they have been? And Carl Bankston at Tulane University is researching and publishing on this. And what Shiloh Dietz, the graduate student in the Public Policy Institute at SIU, and I are interested in is who has been returning to settle in New Orleans? Are people returning home, trickling in over the last 10 years as the city rebuilds, right? Just waiting in San Antonio for federal funding to make it possible for them to come back 10 years later? Or are these new people? And if so, who are these new people? So we have an article that we've written led by Shiloh, who's very skilled in doing GIS mapping, so geographic informational system mapping, to look at patterns of settlement and population loss in New Orleans. So we wanted to better understand how these patterns represent race and gender and class biases post-Katrina. So the St. Roch neighborhood in New Orleans, which was a largely black neighborhood, historically black, right, historical neighborhood, is experiencing a lot of gentrification. I have friends, I have some lily white friends in academia who have bought really cheap houses and are renovating in the St. Roch neighborhood. And maybe a couple of months ago, the neighborhood was in the news because they have a new hoity-toity supermarket, one that I would love to shop at, in the neighborhood. that was vandalized with spray paint. People were spray painting "Yuppies Go Home," right? So people who have been in New Orleans for a while are responding to the race and class gentrification of these historically African American neighborhoods. So in our paper, we go through in detail, we dissect the federal and local government rebuilding efforts in New Orleans, and we unpack the biases in these policies that have led to a whiter, a wealthier, and a younger New Orleans. While the distribution of men and women is approximately pre-storm levels, with 52% women, it was 53.4% women or female before the storm. And so we're approximating those numbers now. It's important to note that female headed household numbers are down. And what we didn't look at, which I think we should go back and look at, is what this means for children as well. So I'm going to explain this, but I thought I would show you the image largely to impress. Everybody loves a good map. So the number of female-headed households in New Orleans has decreased 35% from 2000 to 2013. That's huge. That's huge, right? And with women go other people, right? Go elderly who are reliant on these women to care for them. Go children who women tend to also care for. The loss of female-headed households with children has been even greater. At a loss of 40.9%, as has been the number of those families living in poverty, 39.9% loss. Okay. These women are making decisions for their entire families, including children and adult dependents, as I've already mentioned. And so they have to consider infrastructure, living wages, schools for children, medical care, transportation. Also what explains these numbers is not just the lack of infrastructure, but the closing of housing projects. Okay, so the Big Four housing projects is a very a large and sort of popular housing project in New Orleans. And again, Jessica Party does research on it, where she talks about the fact that although sustaining no damages, the city not only closed these housing projects after Hurricane Katrina, but has never reopened them. And it's a little bit controversial because if you pay attention to New Orleans politics, for years before Hurricane Katrina, the city wanted to get rid of these housing projects. Okay, so the question is, was this the perfect excuse not to reopen them? Okay, and then also housing and rent has skyrocketed. New Orleans housing, I think Tim was telling me earlier, before Hurricane Katrina, the average housing price for a standalone house was $80,000, and today it would be approximately $180,000, so more than double. So who can afford to live in New Orleans? Okay, I'm going to take questions afterwards.
Just wanted an explanation of the map.
Oh, okay.
Is it possible just to orientate where the lower Ninth Ward is, where the lake is, and where the river is?
Oh, yeah, so this is, okay, good question. Okay, so this would be the Mississippi River. Okay, so you would have Uptown here. The university, this is all green, this would be Tulane University. You have Uptown, you have the Warehouse District and the Central Business District, and then you have the French Quarter here, and then around here you have the Bywater, and it starts to get really poor. So here is your largely white, wealthier neighborhoods around Tulane University and Loyola University, and then, let's see, hard to see it so close. And then of course here you have largely historical black neighborhoods. You have the Marigny, but just north of here, which this would be Rampart, I think. You have like the St. Roch neighborhood. You would have the Treme, for example. So a lot of historically African American neighborhoods just in there.
And the lake is the big white space north. So like, the lake is the big white space.
Oh, yeah, right there.
Great, thank you.
Okay. Because New Orleans has failed to build infrastructure for the poor, for poor families, many women have chosen not to return. And so I would go so far as to say that this is a formal pushing out of not just poor black communities, but also of single mothers, right, who are often stigmatized as, dependent on the state. And instead there's, and I think anybody's in here who went to New Orleans with Tim's class in 2013 or 2015?
Raise your hand if you guys were.
Right, did you meet with city officials who talked about who they imagined as the future of New Orleans, being largely young, white, single, professional, white people?
Yes.
Yeah. So there's both a both an unintentional and an intentional rebuilding of the city for particular people. But what I did want to mention before I close out is, sociologists have a tendency to focus on the horrible. Okay, we focus on issues of inequality, the reproduction of, exploitation, and we don't talk a lot about issues of agency and change all of the time because they can be so difficult to find. But there are signs in the literature that point to the importance of women in rebuilding, okay? Well, in both emergency response and rebuilding. Okay, so the question is, how are you going to disseminate, if you create, crisis triage centers for women who are experiencing, sexual and domestic assault, how do you get that information out there? And some community activists are saying via other women, okay, that you're going to rely on women who are connected through, community socializing in some way, whether it's through church or those sorts of things. And so it's important to keep in mind that when we're thinking about these things and we're hopefully building them into emergency response, we need to utilize women as important resources for rebuilding and responding in the communities. And so, women are often on the ground doing activist work with particularly around issues of animal rights and children's activism. But community researchers have found that women are very important in rebuilding our communities. They have shown great resiliency, creativity, and hope in rebuilding their lives and their communities after Hurricane Katrina. From interviews with women disaster survivors, researchers Ophira Davis and Marie Land note the resoluteness of women who have shown amazing strength. While men occupy most state and federal level decision-making positions, local women have been and continue to be key in the rebuilding of New Orleans on the ground through everyday face-to-face interactions with their community members. Without formal recognition or representation in high-level organizations, women have created and participated in grassroots movements to bring New Orleans back socially, culturally, and economically. Women have also been key to preserving homes and memories, local businesses in New Orleans, especially in New Orleans' ethnic and religious enclaves. Women in the local Jewish community, for example, built alliances to halt rebuilding efforts that were unhealthy for their neighborhoods. In one particularly poignant example, a local woman by the name of Miss Rose, very southern, Miss Rose, fought for environmental justice in the city and in the federal treatment of her community. She called upon and worked with other environmental organizations to protect her and her neighbors' homes, and she understood this protection effort as a gendered process with women as guardians of memory and space. some women in the Vietnamese community in Versailles, there's a large Vietnamese community in New Orleans, have created coalitions with other marginalized groups to resist the presence of a dump site, for example, in their neighborhoods. Like, where should we dump all this crap? Well, let's do it in Versailles. Let's do it in the Vietnamese neighborhood, right? Both women and men of this community actively struggled to close the Mentor landfill, but Vietnamese American women sought to find commonality in multiple points of oppression with other communities dealing with similar environmental and social issues during the recovering efforts, right? So the thing that's interesting here is that recovering efforts didn't always really serve the community, or it served particular people in the community, right? So I had this old, like, 1989 Volvo that I had to leave in New Orleans when I came back. All of the candy wrappers and stuff from the floor of my car were stuck to the windows because the water had gone up and slowly decreased, so that all of the junk that sits on my floor was embarrassingly stuck to my windows. And every couple of days I would come out and somebody was driving by writing tow with spray paint on another part of the car, like, just in case you didn't see it on the driver's side door, they painted on the hood, or it was on, like, the roof at some point. I don't know who they thought would see that, and the question was, well, where are they towing this to? Okay, I lived in an uptown. I lived close to Magazine Street, which is a really, is miles of shopping and good eating, and largely white, some of the more wealthy areas. I was a graduate student at the time, and the question was, well, they were taking my trash, where were they taking it, right? And so there's a little bit of research that shows that they're moving it to these communities where people are resisting it being dumped in their backyards. All right, so some of the larger lessons from the literature that is out there on gender and disaster. Gender is a major organizing principle of our lives and shapes how people respond to and experience disaster, and so this should be considered in both disaster research and on-the-ground response. Women have unique needs during disaster, which doesn't differ, which don't differ from everyone else's because they are part of the collective. In other words, again, this idea that if we focus on women's unique needs, we're just considering them, maybe for the first time, part of the collective. Disaster response is not often designed with women and their families in mind. People who had been historically ghettoized into low-lying areas are now pushed out altogether, with many people, many of them being female-headed households, right? So whereas before Katrina we could talk about redlining, we could talk about the, racist geography of New Orleans and why it was that poor blacks were settled along some of the lowest lying neighborhoods along the levee system that some of them had helped build. That we need to consider that these people aren't just ghettoized anymore, but that they might be pushed out altogether, and that this is these aren't, as sociologists would like to highlight, these aren't individual or personal decisions, but they're actually built into the fabric of our city planning efforts. And lastly, that women are important agents of social change, that is, that they're not just high-risk, high-vulnerable groups, but that they're also important in considering community outreach. So where do we go from here? I know it's like one sad little bullet point. Where do we go from here? But I want to stress this, that we should study gendered phenomena of disaster, but also not consider gender a niche aspect of research and policy planning or disaster response. Right? That is, that we shouldn't consider gender on its own, that it's something separate, that it's, a niche area of study, that it's, that it means, biasing our responses, right? Because the point is that if we don't consider women's unique needs, then we're not, generically responding to a generic person anyway on the ground, right? We're forgetting women and their needs. All right, thank you.